Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she discovers a strange book left behind in the village library. A children's storybook with no title, no author, and no record of who borrowed it last. But as she turns the pages, she realizes the stories inside aren't make-believe. They're accounts of real events and real crimes. Each tale ends just before the culprit is revealed, as if someone didn't want the endings to ever be known. Stay with me till the end, because this storybook may be missing a title, but it's hiding a name that should never have been written. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's mystery is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1. A village gathering. It was one of those late summer afternoons in St. Mildred's that seemed as though it had been written expressly for a postcard. The sky was soft blue, the air laced with the scent of lavender, and the slow, drowsy hum of bees moved lazily among the hollyhocks. On the green, white bunting fluttered gently in the breeze, and the annual village storytelling festival was in full swing. Folding chairs dotted the grass, tables sagged under the weight of scones and jam, and the vicar, resplendent in his summer straw hat, was attempting to balance a teacup while congratulating Mrs. Prentice on her victorious sponge. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of a lilac bush, her neat hat perfectly straight, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap. To a casual observer, she might have seemed half absorbed in the story being read aloud from the makeshift stage, but in truth, her pale blue eyes were gently sweeping the scene, catching a whispered exchange here, a stiff smile there, the slight narrowing of an eye from one villager toward another. Years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that such moments, seemingly inconsequential, were the real stories people told. The headline event of the festival was to be the reading of a rare and unpublished manuscript brought by a certain Mr. Horace Welland, a literary gentleman from London. No one in the village had heard of him before this week, but his arrival had caused a pleasant ripple of curiosity. He was tall, with the slightly distracted air of a man accustomed to being listened to, and he wore a suit far too fine for the grass beneath his feet. His manuscript, he had hinted, came from the estate of a rather important novelist, whose identity, he assured everyone, would be revealed during his reading. The villagers had gathered close when he ascended the small platform with a theatrical flourish, producing from a leather case a slim sheaf of yellowed pages. But before a single sentence could be read, the moment was broken by a strange interruption. A gust of wind darted across the green, lifting the top pages as if eager to read them first. Mr. Welland snatched at the papers with a frown, though not before Miss Marple noticed something odd. His hand trembled, but not in the way of a man startled by the weather. It was a deeper tremor, as though some private fear had passed through him. He began to read, his voice rich and confident, and for a while the audience was caught up in the strange, charming tale. Then came a pause long enough for a few heads to turn. Mr. Welland stared down at the page in his hand, as if it had said something quite unexpected. He cleared his throat, read a few more words, then stopped again, his face paling slightly. It was only moments later, just as he reached what appeared to be a dramatic turn in the story, that he faltered altogether. His hand went to his throat, the pages slid from his grasp, and he staggered forward. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The vicar stepped up to steady him, but it was no use. Mr. Welland collapsed across the low table at the front of the stage, the tea service clattering to the ground beside him. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for the doctor. But Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, her eyes quietly on the fallen man, noting not the manuscript, scattered in the grass, but the expressions that flitted across the faces of those standing nearest. Shock, of course, but in one or two. Something else. Within minutes, Dr. Spence arrived, summoned from the far side of the green. He knelt beside Mr. Welland, examined him briefly, and shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid he's gone," he said, his voice low but carrying in the tense silence. The crowd seemed to inhale as one. A death at the village storytelling festival was something none of them could have anticipated. And yet already the murmurs began to swirl. "A heart attack," muttered Mrs. Prentice, who claimed she could tell such things at a glance. The excitement was too much for him, offered the vicar. Miss Marple, still quietly composed, bent to retrieve a single sheet of the fallen manuscript that had landed near her chair. She glanced at the words, half a sentence cut off mid-line, and slipped it gently into her handbag. For all the talk of a heart attack, there was something about the way Mr. Welland had faltered, the way certain eyes in the crowd had darted to one another, that told her this was not merely the sad misfortune of a stranger. A death had come to the village that afternoon, and though the scones might still be eaten and the tea still poured, the quiet peace of St. Mildred's had been well and truly disturbed. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The next morning, the events of the storytelling festival had rippled through every lane and kitchen in St. Mildred's. In the bakery, Mrs. Bellows served seed cake with a side of solemn pronouncements about the frailty of men. From the city, at the post office, Mrs. Cleves whispered darkly about the suspicious timing of Mr. Welland's collapse. Just when he was about to reveal the unnamed author of his manuscript, the vicar, attempting to keep a tone of Christian charity, reminded his flock that speculation was unkind, though even he admitted to Miss Marple that it was a very sudden and distressing business. Miss Marple, as was her way, spent the morning in unobtrusive motion, exchanging a few words here, listening there, sipping her tea slowly while others let their tongues run faster. She had seen this pattern too often to mistake it the moment a death was declared unexpected. The village began to rearrange itself into little camps of suspicion, each one confident in its private explanation. It was not long before she had gathered a short mental list of those whose voices were either too eager or too cautious. At the grocer's, Mrs. Larch claimed she had been close enough to touch Mr. Welland when he fell, and that she had smelled almonds in the air. This was immediately challenged by Mr. Hargreaves, who said that Mrs. Larch had been standing behind the cake stall and could hardly have smelled anything but sugar icing. Meanwhile, the young schoolmistress, Miss Dalton, seemed uncharacteristically pale and flustered, fumbling her coins and leaving without her change. Miss Marple filed the moment away in her mind. People under stress often betrayed themselves not in words, but in small, careless acts. The police had made their appearance early that morning. Sergeant Ames and Inspector Graves, both looking as though they'd rather be anywhere, but sorting through the tangled chatter of a village in the grip of a mystery. Graves, a practical man with little patience for gossip, had already concluded, loudly enough for the publican to overhear, that Mr. Welland had likely suffered a seizure or a sudden stoppage of the heart. These literary types, he remarked, spend all their time indoors. No wonder their bodies give out. The villagers took this as a sign the matter would be quickly closed, but there were undercurrents the inspector did not notice. At the edge of the green, where the bunting still hung limp from the previous day, two figures were seen in quiet conversation. Mr. Edward Prowse, who had been in charge of the festival's finances, and Mrs. Isabel Trent, the formidable chairwoman of the Literary Society. They spoke in low voices, breaking off whenever anyone drew near. More than once, their eyes strayed toward the vicarage garden, where the remaining pages of the manuscript had been placed in safekeeping until Mr. Welland's relatives could be contacted. Miss Marple passed through the green at that moment, pausing to admire the flowers in the church border. To anyone glancing her way, She looked as harmless as a sparrow, but her ears were attuned to the rustle of nervous tones, and her eyes noted the subtle stiffness with which Mrs. Trent avoided glancing directly at her. There was a defensive set to the woman's shoulders, as though she feared a question might be asked for which she did not yet have a proper answer. At luncheon, Miss Marple entertained her nephew Raymond and his wife Joan, who had been staying for a few days. Raymond was amused by the drama, as he called it, and assured his aunt that such things made splendid material for a novel. Miss Marple smiled faintly, remarking that in her experience, real life seldom followed the neat patterns of fiction, but that people's motives, whether in books or in villages, remained much the same. Joan, ever curious, asked if she suspected anyone. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "it is much too soon to suspect. First, one must observe. People are never more revealing than when they think nothing is at stake." That afternoon, a small service was held at the church for those who wished to pay their respects. The body had been moved to Dr. Spence's surgery for examination, but the gathering was a chance for the villagers to display both sympathy and curiosity. Mrs. Larch wore black, though she had not known the man beyond the brief hours of the festival. Mr. Hargreaves lingered near the doorway, claiming he had come to pray but listening intently for news. Miss Dalton kept her head bowed but fidgeted constantly with her gloves, twisting them in her lap until they resembled a wrung cloth. The talk afterward was subdued but steady. A few remarked that the manuscript had not been mentioned during the service, and that it was odd no one seemed to know where Mr. Welland had been staying before his appearance in the village. Mrs. Prentice insisted she had seen him leave the green shortly after the rehearsal the previous evening, accompanied by a tall man in a dark coat, but when pressed, she admitted it had been getting dark and she could not be certain of his face. In the midst of this, Miss Marple noticed Sergeant Ames speaking quietly to Inspector Graves at the far end of the green. Their expressions suggested that something unexpected had arisen. Ames nodded toward the vicarage, and the two men set off briskly in that direction. Miss Marple, with the unhurried gait of one who had all the time in the world, began a slow stroll that would, quite naturally, take her in the same direction. By the time she arrived, the front door of the vicarage was standing open, and Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's housekeeper, was wringing her hands on the step. She told Miss Marple, in a voice half breathless with indignation, that someone had broken into the study. The locked drawer where the manuscript had been kept was open, the papers gone. Nothing else in the room appeared to have been disturbed. Miss Marple murmured a few words of sympathy, her mind already turning over the implications. A man had died in front of the entire village, and now the one tangible link to the circumstances of his death had vanished without a trace. She wondered, though not aloud, whether the manuscript itself had been worth killing for, or whether it was merely the unfortunate stage upon which something more personal had played out. As the inspector began his questioning inside, Miss Marple stepped quietly into the vicarage garden, her eyes following the neat gravel path down toward the side gate. The latch was still swinging slightly, as if it had been used not long before. Somewhere beyond it lay the village, and among its tidy cottages and friendly faces, the first quiet threads of murder had already begun to weave themselves together. Chapter 3. Whispers and watchfulness. That evening, St. Mildred's wore the odd hush that settles over a place when something unpleasant has happened, but no one wishes to be the first to name it aloud. Curtains were drawn a little earlier than usual, lamplight glowed faintly through lace panels, and the steady chime of the church clock felt louder than it ought. In the Rose and Crown, the regulars spoke in lowered tones, not because they feared being overheard, but because a certain solemnity had attached itself to every conversation. Still, even solemnity has its limits. In a village such as this, curiosity was never far from the surface. At a small table near the hearth, Mr. Prowse was in earnest discussion with Mr. Hargreaves, his voice low but his hand gesturing with the insistence of a man, trying to make his point sound reasonable. "The thing is," Prowse said, "you can't put much stock in that talk about almonds. People imagine scents when they're told to look for them. And Dr. Spence hasn't said a word about poison." Hargreaves nodded, though it was the sort of nod that meant he was far from convinced. A few feet away, Mrs. Prentice was recounting again her sighting of the tall man in the dark coat, each telling of the story acquiring a little more detail than the last. Miss Marple, who had stepped in ostensibly to fetch a small packet of tea from the landlord's wife, lingered just long enough to absorb these snippets without appearing to do so. Her years had taught her that direct questioning often stiffened people into guarded replies, whereas the illusion of a casual audience loosened tongues. She said little, only remarking on the weather, and was rewarded with a glimpse of Mrs. Trent entering through the side door, her hat pulled low. The woman's eyes scanned the room swiftly before she crossed to Prowse and said something in a voice too quiet to carry. Whatever it was, it caused Prowse's shoulders to stiffen, and the two of them left together without ordering so much as a lemonade. The next morning, the village was treated to fresh news, or, rather, to the first official statement from Inspector Graves. Standing squarely in front of the post office, he informed those who had gathered under the pretext of needing stamps that the late Mr. Welland's cause of death was still under review. He would not confirm nor deny any suspicion of foul play, but the fact that the manuscript had been stolen was enough to ignite another wave of speculation. Miss Dalton, overhearing, turned white as paper and slipped away down the lane before anyone could engage her in conversation. Miss Marple saw this from a distance and decided, in her own unhurried fashion, to take the same path. She found the young schoolmistress fumbling with her key at the front door of her cottage, her hands unsteady. A gentle word of greeting, the sort that gave no hint of purpose, drew Miss Dalton into a few polite sentences. It was nothing of substance, yet in the slight hesitation before answering a simple question, "Did you enjoy the festival?" Before all the excitement, Miss Marple caught the same disquiet she had noticed the day before. The girl's eyes flicked toward the mantel inside, where a small pile of papers lay. Miss Marple noted the glance and let the conversation drift away, remarking that she would see her at Sunday service. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Spence under the excuse of returning a borrowed gardening book. He was, she knew, one of the few men in the village who valued discretion over chatter. Over tea in his book-lined study, he confided that Mr. Welland's death had indeed presented puzzling aspects, though he would say no more until the final report was complete. What struck Miss Marple most was his casual remark that there had been a peculiar mark on one of the teacups from the refreshment table. The cup, he said, had gone missing before it could be examined further. That evening, the weather turned. A fine mist began to fall, shrouding the village in a soft blur. Lamps lit along the high street cast halos in the damp air, and the quiet was broken only by the sound of footsteps on wet cobbles. Miss Marple, from her sitting-room window, saw a solitary figure moving quickly toward the vicarage gate. It was too dim to make out more than a silhouette tall, with a hat brim low over the face. The figure paused at the gate, glanced around, and then slipped inside. Curiosity stirred. Though Miss Marple made no move to follow, she understood the value of patience, of letting a small act lead to a larger revelation. Instead, she sat back, knitting in her lap, her mind gently turning over the threads she had gathered. A stolen manuscript, a vanished teacup, the tremor in Mr. Welland's hand, the nervous schoolmistress, and the wary glances between Prowse and Mrs. Trent, each detail, by itself, was nothing more than a scrap, but stitched together, they might yet form a pattern, though it was still too soon to see its shape. By morning, the mist had thickened into fog, the kind that made even the nearest hedgerows seem far away. The village moved more slowly under its cover, and perhaps it was for that reason that no one saw who had been at the churchyard before dawn. But when the verger arrived to open the gates, he found something out upon the stone bench by the light gate, a single page. From the missing manuscript, its edges damp, the ink slightly blurred. The page contained no title, no signature, only half a paragraph that ended mid-sentence, as though the rest had been torn away when Miss Marple heard of it by way of Mrs. Cleves, who had just happened to be passing the church at the right time. She merely nodded. Such things, she reflected, had a way of returning to the surface, like a truth someone tried to bury too hastily. The question was, who had placed it there? And was it a warning, a mistake, or an invitation? One thing was certain: the village's peace was no longer merely disturbed, it was unsettled, restless, as though beneath its ordered lanes and prim gardens something unseen had begun to shift. And Miss Marple, ever the quiet watcher, knew that the smallest shift in human nature could bring the whole facade tumbling down. Chapter 4. Shadows in the fog. The fog had not lifted by the following afternoon, but rather thickened into a damp shroud that muffled sound and blurred every familiar outline of St. Mildred's. It was the sort of weather that seemed to slow even thought itself. And yet, in such conditions, certain people moved with purpose. Miss Marple, standing at her gate with a small basket for the grocer, noticed to such purposeful figures. The first was Mrs. Trent. Her gloved hands clutched tightly round a narrow parcel as she crossed the green, glancing over her shoulder twice in as many minutes. The second was Edward Prowse, emerging from the lane behind the church with an umbrella he did not appear to need, for it was not rain, but mist that filled the air. He saw Mrs. Trent but did not call to her. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction, disappearing into the fog toward the post office. Inside the grocer's, the talk was as thick as the weather. Mrs. Bellows, arranging her jars of barley sugar, claimed that the single manuscript page found on the church bench had been delivered to Inspector Graves, but that he had said precisely nothing about its contents. Mrs. Cleves, never to be outdone in the matter of information, insisted she knew someone who had read it, that it was part of a story involving a stolen identity. This naturally produced a dozen questions as to whether the story was pure fiction or something that might reveal the motive for Mr. Welland's untimely end. Miss Marple, accepting her purchases with a nod, listened without visible reaction. She walked home by way of the churchyard, the fog curling low among the stones, making the names on the older markers almost unreadable. At the light gate, she paused, noting that the stone bench where the page had been found was now bare, save for a faint trace of moisture. She touched the bench lightly with her gloved hand. It was colder here than elsewhere, though perhaps it was only the imagination's trick when one is near to a place that has held a secret. That evening, an unexpected call arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was Miss Dalton, looking pale and hesitant, her hands clasped tightly together. She had come, she said, because she couldn't quite settle and thought perhaps a conversation might help her mind. Over tea, she spoke in halting sentences about how dreadful the whole business was, how upsetting to have one's worker pupils, she meant, disrupted by talk of murder. But in between these polite disavowals, small details slipped out. She admitted she had seen Mr. Welland the morning of the festival in the lane behind the schoolhouse, speaking with a man she could not name. They looked cross with each other, she said, then added quickly, "Though I'm sure it was nothing." Miss Marple encouraged her with a soft murmur, not pressing too hard, for she knew that a sudden question might make the young woman retreat altogether. But she noted that Miss Dalton avoided looking directly at her when speaking of the conversation, instead gazing at the framed photograph of Miss Marple's late nephew on the mantel. Avoidance, she knew, could be as telling as an outright lie. After Miss Dalton left, The village seemed to fold back into its strange, fog-bound quiet. Lamps glowed dimly in the windows across the green, their light unable to pierce more than a yard or two into the gloom. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, whereupon steadily, her mind threading together the points she had so far gathered, the tremor in Welland's hand, the missing teacup, the stolen manuscript, the nervous young schoolmistress, the guarded glances of Mrs. Trent and Mr. Prowse, and now this unexplained quarrel before the festival began. The next day brought a ripple of fresh disturbance. Word spread that someone had tried to enter the vicarage again during the night. Nothing appeared to have been taken, but a muddy footprint had been found near the study window, a man's boot, with a distinct worn patch on the heel. The vicar, flustered, suggested it might have been a tradesman calling late, but the police seemed less willing to dismiss it. Inspector Graves examined the print closely, then instructed Sergeant Ames to make quiet inquiries among the local cobblers. Miss Marple, hearing of the incident from Mrs. Weatherby, kept her own counsel, though she could not help thinking that a second attempt on the vicarage suggested the stolen manuscript was not the only thing someone wished to keep out of sight. Perhaps there were other papers, other evidence, that had not yet come to light. That afternoon, the fog began to thin in ragged patches, revealing the outlines of the cottages once more. Miss Marple took the opportunity to walk toward the far end of the village, where the old mill house stood empty save for occasional visits from its caretaker. It was there, by the bend in the path, that she encountered Edward Prowse. He seemed startled to see her, though he quickly masked it with a smile and some remark about the weather. Yet his eyes flicked toward the mill house in a way that betrayed a certain preoccupation. Miss Marple returned his greeting pleasantly and walked on, but in her mind she marked him down as a man with something to hide. When evening came, the village was restless once again. At the Rose and Crown, voices rose in argument over whether the page found at the church had been a deliberate plant to mislead the police, or whether it had been dropped by accident. Mrs. Prentice declared, with the satisfaction of someone unveiling a certainty, that she believed the story in the manuscript was about someone right here in St. Mildred's, and that the killer's motive was to keep that story from ever being told. The thought sent a fresh shiver through the room, for it was one thing to imagine a quarrel between strangers, and quite another to believe that the crime had roots in their own soil. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea at home, reflected on Mrs. Prentice's theory. The idea was not without merit. She herself had often found that the motives for violence were rarely exotic. More often than not, they were woven from the oldest threads of all fear, pride, greed, and the desperate wish to keep certain truths from being known. And somewhere in the village, she was certain, someone was watching as closely as she was, but with very different intentions. Chapter 5. A clue in conversation. The next morning, the fog had all but lifted, revealing the village with that peculiar clarity that comes after days of mystic clarity, that seemed to sharpen not only the air, but the eyes with which people regarded one another. The gossip that had been half muffled in the damp now flowed more freely, and it seemed no doorstep, shop counter, or garden gate was without its little knot of conversation. Miss Marple, from her customary seat by the front window, could see Mrs. Larch gesturing emphatically to Mrs. Cleves outside the greengrocer's, her hands fluttering like small flags. Whatever she was saying drew first a sharp gasp, then a pursed-lipped silence from her listener. At the same time, Miss Marple noticed something less obvious, but more interesting. Across the green, Edward Prowse emerged from the post office carrying a long, narrow envelope. He opened it immediately, scanning the contents before slipping it into his coat pocket. There was nothing unusual in a man receiving a letter, of course, but the way he had looked about him before breaking the seal, as though to ensure no one was watching, gave the act an edge of secrecy. Miss Marple filed the detail away. Secrecy, she knew, was rarely a neutral thing. Shortly after elevenses, she received a call from Mrs. Weatherby at the vicarage, who invited her to tea to help soothe the vicar's nerves. It transpired that the second attempted intrusion had left him rather unsettled, though he maintained a polite composure in public. At the vicarage, over sponge cake and a particularly fragrant pot of Darjeeling, Miss Marple listened as the vicar described the previous night in more detail than Mrs. Weatherby had given. He had been in his study until 10:30 when he heard what he thought was the faint scrape of a shoe outside. By the time he rose to look, the sound had gone, but he noticed that the latch on the side gate was ajar. As they talked, the vicar recalled something else. He had found a small shred of paper on the floor near the desk that morning. It bore only the tail of a printed letter, the sort one might find in a typescript, but the edge was torn as if it had been ripped from a larger sheet. He had thought it too insignificant to mention to the inspector, but Miss Marple asked if she might see it. It was indeed nothing more than a fragment, but it carried a faint smell, one she recognized instantly: tobacco of the strong, unfiltered variety rarely used except by those with a taste for it. She thought of the few men in St. Mildred's who smoked such tobacco, and her mind alighted on one in particular. Later that afternoon, as she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple passed the school just as the day's lessons were ending. Children spilled out into the lane, their voices high and merry, while Miss Dalton stood in the doorway, bidding them goodbye. The young woman looked tired, shadows under her eyes, but she managed a smile when she saw Miss Marple. They exchanged a few pleasantries, and then, quite without prompting, Miss Dalton mentioned that she had been unable to sleep the night before, and had seen a light moving near the mill house from her bedroom window. She had thought it perhaps the caretaker, but it had been far too late for such work. Miss Marple did not press her, but she was thinking now of the path she had seen Prowse take toward that same mill house 2 days earlier. She began to suspect that the missing manuscript or parts of it might have traveled there. The evening brought a different sort of engagement, the Literary Society's regular meeting at Mrs. Trent's house. It was, by all appearances, a perfectly ordinary gathering, complete with seed cake and a discussion of minor poets. Yet Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Trent was unusually careful about who sat where, ensuring that Prowse was on one side of the room and Miss Dalton on the other. Moreover, when the conversation turned inevitably to the tragedy at the festival, Mrs. Trent was quick to dismiss it as an unfortunate accident, and to steer the topic back to literature. This in itself was nothing remarkable, but her hand trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and more than once her eyes flicked toward the clock on the mantel, as though she were waiting for a particular moment to pass. When the meeting concluded, Miss Marple lingered a few moments longer than the others, ostensibly to compliment Mrs. Trent on her lemon curd. This allowed her to observe a curious scene. As the last guest departed, Mrs. Trent closed the door quickly and went to the bureau in the corner. She unlocked the top drawer, removed something small and flat, and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan before hurrying into the kitchen. Miss Marple did not see what it was, but she caught the faint rustle of paper. That night, as the village settled into quiet, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reviewing the day's encounters. The torn fragment from the vicarage, the sighting of a light at the mill house, the anxious behavior of Mrs. Trent, and Prowse's secretive letter, all these things, she felt, were connected, though the threads between them remained just out of reach. She thought again of the page from the manuscript left on the church bench. Was it truly an accident, or was someone trying to control which parts of the story were seen? Outside, the moon had risen, casting pale light over the damp cobbles of the lane. Somewhere beyond her window, an owl called softly from the churchyard. Miss Marple listened for a moment, her knitting needles poised in her lap, and thought how often human misdeeds began quietly, under cover of night, long before the first open act that brought them to light. The night hid many things, but for those who knew how to look, it also revealed them. Chapter 6. The mill house in the morning next day broke with a pale, wintry sunlight that turned the damp roofs to silver and lent the village an air of deceptive calm. Church bells rang faintly in the distance, though it was not a Sunday, and the sound carried oddly in the stillness. Miss Marple, watching from her parlor window, saw Edward Prowse cross the green at a brisk pace, a small leather case in his hand. He walked not toward his usual haunts, but along the lane that curved out toward the mill house, a route that, in Miss Marple's experience, few took unless they had a particular purpose. She decided that her morning errands might, quite innocently, include that direction. Taking her basket, she set off at a steady, unhurried pace, greeting those she passed with her customary politeness. The air held the smell of wet earth and early frost, and the hedgerows glittered with dew. As she approached the bend before the mill, she slowed, listening. Somewhere ahead came the faint creak of a door's hinges, followed by the muffled thud of something being set down. The mill house, when it came into view, looked as it always had, its stone walls weathered, its windows shuttered on the upper floors, but the side door stood ajar, and a narrow line of sunlight spilled across the yard. Miss Marple, careful not to be seen, paused just far enough back to observe. Edward Prowse emerged carrying a bundle wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string. He glanced about, then locked the door behind him before heading back toward the village by a different path. She waited until his figure had vanished from sight before approaching the building. The door was indeed locked, but the ground nearby told its own story. The earth was disturbed in a way that suggested more than one set of feet had passed recently, one boot print with the distinctive, worn heel she had heard described from the vicarage, and another lighter tread, perhaps a woman's shoe. There was also a scrap of string, freshly cut, lying in the mud. Miss Marple did not linger. She had no desire to be caught in a place where she had no reason to be, but her mind was busy as she turned back toward the main road. The bundle Prowse carried, the light seen there by Miss Dalton, the boot print at the vicarage, it was not proof, but it was a shape beginning to emerge. As a sketch emerges under a careful hand, back in the village, the Rose and Crown was already hosting a small gathering of morning regulars. Mrs. Larch was in the midst of telling a group that she had once read a thrilling novel in which a manuscript was stolen for the secrets it contained. "Mark my words," she declared, "it's the same here, and I'd wager the story was about someone very close indeed." There was a murmur of agreement, though Mrs. Cleves sniffed and said that, if it were truly so, Inspector Graves would have arrested someone by now. Miss Marple, quietly ordering a pot of tea from the landlord's wife, listened without joining in. She knew the inspector well enough to recognize his reluctance to move before he was certain, and certainty, in such matters, was not quickly come by. Still, she noted that when Mrs. Trent entered moments later, the conversation faltered, as if some unspoken understanding passed among those present. Mrs. Trent took a seat in the far corner, her back to the window, and kept her eyes lowered, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's door, Sergeant Ames, his manner polite but purposeful. He explained that Inspector Graves was making inquiries about any sightings near the mill house, and wondered if she might have noticed anything. Miss Marple, with her usual air of gentle vagueness, admitted she had passed by that way on her morning errands, but had seen nothing. She could be certain of just a door ajar and the impression that someone had been there recently. Ames thanked her, though she saw the faint flicker of disappointment in his eyes after he left. She sat a while in her garden, watching the pale light fade over the hedges. Somewhere in the distance, The faint ring of a bicycle bell sounded an oddly cheerful note against the stillness of the day. It brought her thoughts back to the festival itself, to the moment Mr. Welland had faltered. She remembered the way his eyes had fixed on something or someone in the crowd before he fell, and she wondered how many others had noticed. Evening came with a chill, and as Miss Marple lit her lamp, she resolved to pay a call on Miss Dalton the next day. The young schoolmistress had twice now hinted at knowledge without fully giving it voice, and Miss Marple sensed that a gentle nudge might coax more into the open. But for tonight, she was content to let her thoughts rest on the quiet certainty that, like the slow turning of a key, the truth was working its way toward the light. In St. Mildred's, the lamps burned steadily, the lanes lay empty, and the mill house stood silent at the edge of the village. Yet beneath this outward calm, the quiet machinery of human fear, ambition, and secrecy was at work, shaping events as surely as any visible hand. And Miss Marple, in her neat parlor, sat knitting with the patient assurance of someone who knew that all knots, however tightly tied, could be undone if one only took the trouble to find the right thread. Chapter 7. A disclosure over teeth. Following morning was crisp and bright, the kind of autumn day that seemed to invite honesty or at least make concealment more difficult. The sunlight filtered through thinning leaves, casting dappled patterns on the pavements of St. Mildred's. Miss Marple rose early, her mind set on the quiet but deliberate visit she had planned to Miss Dalton's cottage. The young schoolmistress had danced around too many half-statements for Miss Marple's liking, and the moment felt right for a little gentle persuasion. Miss Dalton opened the door looking as though she had slept poorly, her hair pinned hastily, her eyes shadowed. She welcomed Miss Marple in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and set about making tea. The sitting room was small and orderly, but on the writing desk by the window lay a scattering of exercise books, a fountain pen uncapped beside them, and more interestingly, a folded piece of paper that had clearly been handled often. Miss Marple's eyes took in these details without the faintest flicker of interest on her face. Over tea, Miss Marple let the conversation drift from the weather to the school children's autumn projects, and from there, quite by chance, it seemed, to the festival. Miss Dalton's voice caught slightly when speaking of Mr. Welland's death. "It was so sudden," she murmured. "One moment he was perfectly fine, the next—" She trailed off, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Miss Marple did not interrupt, only waited, her expression one of mild, patient concern. At last, Miss Dalton set down her cup and leaned forward a little, her voice dropping. "I didn't mean to get involved," she said. "I never wanted any part of it. But that morning before the festival I saw Mr. Welland again, near the old stone wall behind the school. He was arguing with Mrs. Trent. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know they were talking about money. She kept telling him it isn't yours to sell, and he said something about publishing anyway." Miss Dalton's eyes darted to the desk where the folded paper lay, then quickly back to her guest. Miss Marple, with the lightest nod, acknowledged the confidence. "It is often the case," she said gently, "that one finds oneself in possession of a detail others might overlook, and sometimes that detail can help prevent a great many misunderstandings." She made no attempt to ask directly about the paper. She had learned that pressing too soon only made people defensive. Instead, she rose after finishing her tea, thanked Miss Dalton for her kindness, and remarked that she hoped they might speak again soon. On her way back through the village, Miss Marple encountered Sergeant Ames, who seemed preoccupied. He revealed, in guarded terms, that the inspector had received an anonymous note that morning. It had been pushed under the station door in the night and consisted of a single sentence. "The rest of it is where the water runs slow." Neither Ames nor Graves could make sense of it, though they were considering a search along the riverbank. Miss Marple tucked the phrase into her thoughts. In her mind's eye, she could see the slow eddies near the old mill wheel, where silt and debris often collected. Later that afternoon, she took a turn through the churchyard and found the vicar speaking with Mrs. Trent, their expressions serious. Mrs. Trent looked pale and tight-lipped, and she broke off the conversation abruptly when she saw Miss Marple, excusing herself with a hasty nod. The vicar, when asked after her health, merely said she had been under some strain of late and had sought his counsel. That, Miss Marple reflected, might well be true, but it was equally possible that the counsel she sought was less spiritual and more practical in nature. Evening brought a change in the weather. Clouds gathered, and a thin drizzle began to fall, blurring the lamplight in the windows. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, let her mind wander back over the last few days: the stolen manuscript, the vanished teacup, Prowse's early morning trip to the mill, Mrs. Trent's argument with Mr. Welland, and now this cryptic message about where the water runs slow. Each element seemed to belong to the same picture, yet the outlines were still faint. She suspected that the answer, when it came, would be more a matter of human pride and fear than of anything purely material. As the clock chimed 8, she heard footsteps outside her gate. A moment later, there was a knock, soft, hesitant. When she opened the door, she found Edward Prowse standing there, hat in hand. His face set in an expression that might have been intended as calm, but was strained at the edges. He asked if he might speak with her privately. Inside, he remained standing, glancing once toward the curtained windows before saying, "I don't know what you've heard, Miss Marple, but I can tell you this. If the police keep poking around the mill, they'll find nothing that matters to them, but it could ruin the lives of people who don't deserve it." His tone was almost pleading, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it: resentment, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "It is often difficult," she said, "to decide what should remain hidden and what must come to light. And in my experience, the decision is rarely left to us in the end." She offered him tea, but he declined, muttering that he had somewhere to be, and left with a quick, almost furtive step. When the door closed, Miss Marple stood for a moment in the quiet, her hands folded before her. She was certain now that the mill house was central to the matter, and that both Prowse and Mrs. Trent knew more than they were willing to admit. The question that remained was whether the truth was bound up in the manuscript, or whether the manuscript had been only the key to a far older lock. Chapter 8. Where the water runs slow. Drizzle of the previous evening had thickened into a steady rain by morning, turning the green to a darker shade and leaving a sheen upon the cobbles. From her parlor window, Miss Marple watched the villagers hurry along with their collars turned up, umbrellas tilting against the wind. The weather, she thought, often made people careless. In the rush to be home and dry, they overlooked things they might otherwise keep hidden. She decided it was an opportune moment to see for herself the place the anonymous note had spoken of, where the water runs slow. She took her stout walking stick and an oilskin coat and set off, her progress steady but unhurried. The lane toward the mill was quiet, save for the soft hiss of rain in the hedgerows. When she reached the old wooden bridge just beyond the wheel, she paused to look over the side. The mill stream was swollen from recent rains, rushing in places, but near the bend where the bank curved inward, the water moved in a lazy circle, carrying with it bits of leaves and twigs that swirled before settling against the reeds. It was here that the current slowed enough to let the silt gather, and she thought other things as well. Leaning carefully over, she noticed something caught among the reeds: a scrap of brown paper, darkened by the water but still bound with a fragment of string. With a little maneuvering, she managed to hook it with her stick and draw it up. The paper was sodden, the string frayed, but there was no mistaking its resemblance to the wrapping she had seen in Prowse's hands days earlier. It was empty now, but the fold marks suggested it had once held something: flat pages, perhaps. She tucked it discreetly into her coat pocket and continued along the path. the mill looming silent beside her. Its windows were closed, and no sign of movement came from within. But she could not shake the feeling that someone might be watching from behind the dark glass. She did not linger. An appearance of idle wandering was best maintained by keeping to a plausible route, and so she followed the path back toward the village, pausing now and then to greet those she passed. At the post office, she encountered Mrs. Cleves, who was eager to share that Sergeant Ames had been down to the riverbank that morning. With a most determined expression, he had, according to her cousin's neighbor, been searching along the reeds, but come up with nothing more than a bit of driftwood. Miss Marple merely nodded, concealing her knowledge that the search had not been quite as fruitless as reported, only that she had found her piece earlier and unobserved. The afternoon brought a brief clearing of the rain, and with it a small stir of activity in the green. Mrs. Trent crossed from the direction of the vicarage, her hat pulled low, a folded umbrella in her hand. She spoke briefly with Prowse, their conversation brisk and without the lingering glances of old friends. It was the kind of exchange, Miss Marple thought, between two people who share a pressing matter they would rather not discuss in public. When they parted, Prowse headed toward the mill road while Mrs. Trent continued toward her own house, quickening her pace as she went. Miss Marple spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through her own notes, mental and otherwise. The argument between Mrs. Trent and Mr. Welland, Miss Dalton's sighting of a light at the mill, the worn heel mark at the vicarage, the paper parcel in Prowse's hands, and now the wrapping she had pulled from the reeds. All these were not isolated events, but parts of a pattern. The difficulty was that she could not yet see whether the pattern belonged to the theft of a manuscript, the concealment of a more serious crime, or both at once. That evening, she received a surprise visitor, Inspector Graves himself, his coat still beaded with rain. He was courteous, but there was a guarded quality to his questions as he inquired whether she had happened to walk near the mill that day. She admitted she had, explaining with a smile that she liked to take her exercise regardless of the weather, but she offered no mention of what she had found. It was, she felt, not yet the time. Graves left with a word of thanks, though his eyes lingered on her a moment, as if suspecting she knew more than she was saying. Night settled heavily over the village, the rain returning in fits and starts. In her parlor, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the damp scrap of brown paper laid on the side table beside her. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind worried at the edges of the roof. Somewhere out there, she thought, the rest of the manuscript might still be hidden, perhaps at the mill, perhaps already moved. But if the anonymous note had been meant as a clue, it had not been left for the police. No, it had been for someone who could read between the lines, someone who knew how to listen to what was not said as much as to what was. She resumed her knitting, the faintest smile touching her lips. In her experience, secrets rarely stayed where they were put, and those who tried to hide them often ended up revealing more than they intended. The water might run slow in that bend of the stream, but in the quiet undercurrents of human nature, things moved more swiftly, and she had learned long ago to follow the current until it brought the truth to the surface. Chapter 9. An evening at the vicarage next day brought a deceptive calm to St. Mildred's. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and the sky washed a pale blue, the sort of weather that encouraged the illusion that all was well. But in the faces of the villagers, Miss Marple saw the same underlying tension, as if each person had begun to wonder whether the business with Mr. Welland was drawing toward a conclusion or slipping further into dangerous territory. The police had made no arrests, and Inspector Graves remained notably tight-lipped, which in Miss Marple's experience meant he either had more than he wished to reveal or less than he cared to admit. Late that afternoon, an invitation arrived from Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's housekeeper, suggesting Miss Marple join a small gathering at the vicarage that evening. Mrs. Weatherby, described it as a chance to keep everyone's spirits up, though Miss Marple suspected it was equally an opportunity for the vicar to listen to the undercurrents of conversation. She accepted readily, for gatherings, however innocent in appearance, had a way of revealing more than solitary questioning ever could. The vicarage drawing room was warm with lamplight when she arrived. A small fire glowed in the hearth, and the scent of fresh scones drifted from the kitchen. Present were Mrs. Trent, seated rather stiffly near the window, Edward Prowse, who stood at the mantelpiece nursing a cup of tea, Miss Dalton, looking nervous but trying to smile, and Dr. Spence, whose calm presence lent a certain steadiness to the group. The vicar moved between them, offering refills and genial remarks. Though his eyes missed little, conversation began with safe topics: the weather, the autumn fete, a recent recital in the church hall, but gradually, as Miss Marple had expected, it circled back toward the festival and Mr. Welland. Mrs. Trent was quick to say how tragic it had been, her tone carefully measured, but when Prowse interjected that the whole affair had been blown out of proportion, she glanced at him sharply, as though warning him to hold his tongue. Miss Dalton, catching the look, faltered in her attempt to join in and retreated into silence. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, watching the subtle play of expressions. She noticed how Mrs. Trent's hands tightened on her teacup whenever the manuscript was mentioned, and how Prowse, despite his outward composure, could not resist glancing toward her when certain remarks were made. Dr. Spence, for his part, seemed to observe both of them with the detached interest of a man who suspected more than he was saying. It was during a lull in the conversation that the vicar mentioned, almost in passing, that the police had searched near the river the previous day. "They found very little, I gather," he said, though there was some talk of a bit of wrapping paper caught in the reeds. The comment drew a flicker of reaction from Prowse so slight that it might have passed unnoticed, had Miss Marple not been watching. His hand paused halfway to his mouth, his gaze fixed briefly on the fire before he resumed his motion. Mrs. Trent, however, did not look at him. Instead, she smoothed her skirt and remarked that such things could have been blown there by the wind from anywhere. Shortly after, Miss Dalton dropped her handkerchief, and as Miss Marple stooped to retrieve it, her eyes fell upon a corner of paper protruding from the young woman's handbag. It was folded small, but she could see it bore the same yellowed tone as the manuscript page she had glimpsed before. She returned the handkerchief without comment, but the sight confirmed her suspicion that Miss Dalton, whether willingly or not, possessed a piece of the missing work. When the evening drew to a close, the guests began to make their way out into the cool night. Miss Marple lingered just long enough to exchange a few words with Dr. Spence, who remarked that our Mr. Welland seemed to be a man with a knack for making enemies quickly. His tone was mild, but there was weight behind the words. She agreed quietly, adding that sometimes it was not enmity alone, but the knowledge of certain truths that placed a person in danger. Walking home, she let the night air clear her thoughts. The image of the sodden wrapping from the river lingered in her mind, alongside the way Prowse had stiffened at the vicar's remark and the flash of yellowed paper in Miss Dalton's bag. It was becoming increasingly clear that the manuscript was less an innocent literary relic and more a lever, something that could be used to force a hand, settle a score, or perhaps silence a truth that someone feared. At her gate, she paused to glance back toward the vicarage, where a faint light still glowed in the drawing room. Somewhere behind those windows, she thought, lay the key to the matter. It might be hidden in Mrs. Trent's guarded composure, in Prowse's quick defensiveness, or in the quiet unease of Miss Dalton. But it was there, and like this slow turn of the river near the mill, the truth was moving steadily toward the open. Inside, she laid aside her knitting and took out the scrap of brown paper she had retrieved from the water. Holding it in the lamplight, she traced the faint, blurred creases with her fingertips. A wrapping such as this might have been discarded carelessly, or it might have been thrown away in haste when there was no time to burn it. Either way, she thought, it had drifted into her hands for a reason. In her experience, such reasons had a way of making themselves known, often when the person who had tried to hide them least expected it. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Margans. 2 days later, St. Mildred's awoke to the news that Inspector Graves intended to bring the matter of Mr. Welland's death to a close. There was to be a meeting at the vicarage that afternoon, ostensibly to share findings with those most closely involved. The announcement was met with a mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the village disliked its routines being unsettled. Unease, because no one quite knew which way the matter would turn or whose name might be spoken aloud. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes early, a small knitting bag on her arm and a calm expression that revealed nothing. She found the drawing room prepared much as it had been at their last gathering, the fire glowing, tea set neatly on the side table, chairs drawn into a loose circle. Already there were Mrs. Trent, pale but composed, Edward Prowse, outwardly relaxed yet with a certain stiffness about his shoulders, Miss Dalton, clutching her handbag as though it contained her safety, and Dr. Spence, quietly observant. Inspector Graves stood near the mantel, his manner brisk. "Thank you all for coming. I believe we can now resolve this matter. Mr. Welland did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, most likely in his tea, during the festival. The stolen manuscript was not a random theft, it was the motive. There was a stir in the room." Mrs. Trent's hand gripped the arm of her chair. Miss Dalton's eyes flickered to the floor. Prowse looked, for the first time, directly at Graves, his jaw set. Graves continued, "The manuscript, as we have learned, contained more than unpublished fiction. It told a story thinly disguised that revealed a scandal from some years past, a financial scheme, fraudulent in nature, implicating certain names that, if made public, would ruin reputations. Mr. Welland had acquired it and intended to publish. That is why he was killed." At this, Miss Marple's soft voice broke the silence. "And the reason it has been so difficult to untangle," she said, "is because the manuscript was not in one piece. It had been divided, part in the vicarage, part with Miss Dalton, and part hidden at the mill. Each person who had a piece thought they could either protect themselves or bargain with the others." Miss Dalton's cheeks flushed. She stammered, "I didn't. I only kept it because I was afraid." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Afraid. Because you saw Mrs. Trent and Mr. Welland quarreling and later found that page dropped near the school. You feared being drawn in, but you kept it, and by doing so, became a target yourself." Mrs. Trent's voice came sharp. "And what of Prowse? He's the one who hid the rest at the mill." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Prowse. "Indeed. The worn heel mark found at the vicarage was yours, Mr. Prowse. You returned after the first search to see if anything else perhaps incriminating had been left behind. And when the police began looking near the river, you removed the bundle from the mill, but not quickly enough to prevent a piece of its wrapping from drifting downstream." Prowse's expression hardened. "If you knew all that, you know I wasn't the one who poisoned him." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "The poison was in the tea, and it was Mrs. Trent who poured it, not because she hated Mr. Welland, but because he had refused her offer to buy back the manuscript and threatened to expose her part in that old scheme. She thought if he were gone, the remaining pages could be gathered quietly and destroyed. What she didn't account for was that others, Mr. Prowse among them, had their own interest in holding pieces back, perhaps as insurance." The room was silent, save for the faint hiss of the fire. Mrs. Trent's hands tightened once more, then relaxed. "He would have ruined me," she said simply. "And for what?" "A bit of paper and some ink." Graves stepped forward, his voice firm. "For the truth, Mrs. Trent, That's what he had, and now so do we. It was not a dramatic arrest. Mrs. Trent merely stood, straightened her coat, and allowed the inspector to lead her out. Prowse remained seated, his eyes on the floor, knowing his own part in the concealment would not pass without consequence. Miss Dalton sat very still, as though afraid to move, when the room had emptied. Dr. Spence looked at Miss Marple with quiet admiration. "You saw it all before anyone else did, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "Not all, Doctor, but one learns, after a lifetime of observation, that people rarely succeed in hiding what truly troubles them. They show it in a glance, a gesture, an over-hasty denial. The manuscript may have told a story in words, but the real story was written in the margins, on the faces, and in the silences of those who touched it." That evening, St. Mildred's returned to its usual rhythms. Lamps glowed warmly in windows, the smell of supper drifted from kitchen doors, and the green lay still under the starlight, but there lingered in the air a faint sense of what had passed, that even in the most peaceful of places, human nature could stir up undercurrents deep enough to drown the truth, unless someone was there to patiently draw it to the surface. In her parlor, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the click of needles steady in the quiet. Outside, the millstream moved on, its surface smooth once more, though she knew well enough that in the bend where the water ran slow, Silton's secrets would always find their way to settle.